We continue now at the top of Daf Ayin Zayin Amud Aleph and Meseches Bava Metzia. This is Bava Metzia Daf 77a. This daf is sponsored by David Grossman. Thank you for your sponsorship. If you would like to sponsor an Amud or a daf, see the description box below, and see the description box below to see how you can support this channel. On the previous Amud, Rava said, if a person hired workers to till a field and then it turned out that the field was wet, so if they inspected the land the night before, then pseida de poalim, then it's going to be a loss for the workers, meaning to say he does not have to pay the workers in that case. Rashi explains, pseida de poalim geshamim sheyardu hefsid poalimhu. The fact that it rained, that's a loss to the workers. De lo yoiv lehu midi, he doesn't have to pay them anything. De yamar lehu mazlaichu garam, he can say to them, it was your bad fortune. However, lo saira le'are miorsa, if they did not inspect the land the night before, then pseida de balabayas, then it's going to be the loss of the balabayas. V'yoiv lehu kapol batal, he has to pay them like an idle worker. And Rashi explains, lo saira meorsa pseida de balabayas, if they didn't inspect it the night before, it's the loss of the balabayas. The amri lei, because they say to him, mi yemer da adaita dahu hara agartan, who says that it was on the condition or on the understanding that this would be the state of the land, that you hired us, and therefore they should be paid in this situation. And the Gemara continues, v'yamar Rav, and Rava says, Haiman da oger agure ledavla, if somebody hires workers to irrigate a field, v'yasa mitra, then it rains, so it's not necessary, pseida de poalim, that's going to be a loss to the workers, they don't get paid in that case. Asa nahara, now if the river comes, it essentially overflows its banks and irrigates the field in that fashion. Pseida de balabayas, then it's a loss of the balabayas. V'yoiv lehu kapol batal, again he has to pay them like idle workers. And Rashi explains, ledavla lahashko sados, to irrigate the fields, that's what he hires them for. V'yasa mitra v'hishko saf, it rains and that causes it to not require irrigation. Ve'in tzrich ledavla, doesn't need to be irrigated. So in that situation we say that it is a loss of the workers. But asa nara godal hanahar v'yolav v'nichnas becharitzin ha'asuyin besada, let's say the river, it overflows its banks, it goes into the ditches that go towards the field. Umeheni shosa ve'in tzrich ledavla, now it doesn't need to be irrigated. So in that situation that's a loss of the balabayas, pseida de balabayas, it's a loss of the balabayas. The poalim einan yodin b'minag sadeu, because the workers don't know how the field works that this could happen. She'enar olal hashko, so that the river could overflow and irrigate it. Achu haya yodeh, he was the only one that knew that. Therefore, it's going to be his loss. He has to pay them. Kepoel batal, he has to pay them like idle workers. And the Gemara continues, V'yamar Rav, and Rava says, Haiman de oger aguri ledavl, again somebody hires workers to irrigate his field. Upasak nahara bepalga diyuma, and then the river stops halfway through the day, meaning they can no longer do the work. So ilo avid de pasuk, if this is not something that normally happens, the river doesn't normally stop, pseida de poalim, so then it's a loss of the workers. But avid de pasuk, if it is something that does generally happen, so ibnei masa, if they are from that city and they know that that could happen, pseida de poalim, so then it's a loss of the workers. But lav bnei masa, but if they're not from that city, they don't know that that's something that would generally happen, pseida de balabayas, then it is going to be the loss of the balabayas. V'yamar Rav, and Rava says, Haiman da'agar agure la'avidita v'sholim avidita b'palga diyuma. Let's say somebody hires workers to do work, and the work is completed halfway through the day. He islay avidita denicha mina. If he has work that is easier to do than the work he hired them for, yoivluhu, then he can give them that work. He can tell them they have to work the whole day, and they'll do this other task. Inami dechavasim mefakid lahu, or if he has work that's similar, he's allowed to instruct them to do that. Tekasha mina, but if the work is more difficult, so lo mefakid lahu, that he can't instruct them to do. V'nosin lem scharim mishulim, and he has to pay them their full wages. The Gemara says, Amai, why does he have to pay them their full wages just because he doesn't have other work? V'leisav lu kapol batal, he should just pay them like idle workers since they're not doing anything. And the Gemara says to that, Kikam Rava, when Rava said that they have to pay full, ba'achlushe de mechuzah, that's talking about the workers of mechuzah. Dilo avdi cholshi, if they don't work, they actually get weaker. It's very hard for them to do nothing. And in that situation, they have to be paid their full pay. And the Gemara continues, Amar Mar, the master said, Shamin lohem es masha asu, according to the Tanakam of the Bryce on the previous Amud, you evaluate what they did, meaning to say, let's say they did half the work, you give them half the pay. Ketzad how so, hayayav shisha dinarim, if the work, let's say the second half of the work would actually cost more, because wages have gone up, the second half of the work would be 6 dinarim, still no sein lahem sela, still he has to give them half of their wages, he gives them a sela. And the Gemara explains, Kasavri Rabbanan Yad Poel Al Halyona, the Rabbanan hold that the worker has the upper hand. That's why even though the wage rates have gone up, still they get the prorated pay. They get to be paid half the wages, let's say, if they did half of the work. And Rashi explains, Achlushe de Mechuza, the workers of Mechuza, but Mechuza Shu'iro Shel Rava, Mechuza was the city of Rava, Hayu B'nei Adam Haragilim Lases Masos Tamidu Cheshiyoshim B'Telim Kashalan. It was a place where people used to carry things all the time, carry burdens all the time, and when they were doing nothing, that was actually hard for them, so they get paid full in this case. Yad Poel al Halyona, again, the Tanakama of the Bryce in the previous summit holds the worker has the upper hand. V'afilu hu chozer bo. The point is, even if the worker is the one that retracts, he gets the upper hand. Yachol achzer bo, because he's allowed to retract. Kedechsev, as it's written in the pasuk, ki avoday heim. They are my servants, meaning Klal Yisrael is my servants. V'lo avodim la'avodim. They're not servants to servants, meaning to say nobody can be like an eved. The poel, the worker, has a right to retract. Umehacha yolef love parakam into Kiddushin. This is where we learn this from in the first parak of Kiddushin. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Bryce on the previous summit said, "O yigmuru malachtan v'yitelu shnei slime." If they want, they can complete their work for the agreed upon wage, and they can take the 2 slime. And the Gemara says, Pshita, that's obvious. Of course, if they complete the work, then they should be paid what they agreed upon. And the Gemara says, Lo no tzrich, it's necessary, dayakar avidita, because what happened was, in the middle of the day, wage rates went up. V'emru poalim, and therefore the workers rebelled. They decided they didn't want to do the work anymore, since they saw that pay had gone up. V'azal balabayas ufaisinu, and then the balabayas came and he appeased them, he convinced them to do the work. So ma'u detema, what might you have said, matzu amri lei, they can say to him, kim efaisinu nadaita de tafas lana agra. You appeased us, and we assumed that was because you were going to pay us more, since the rates went up. Kamash Malana comes to teach us, Diyamar lahu, that he says to them, the owner says to them, Adaita de tarachna lahu b'achilu shasiya. The understanding was that I would give you better food and drink while you were working, but I don't need to pay you more. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Bryce again in the previous summit said, Sela no selem sela. Let's say the wage is the same. It's a sela to complete the other half of the work. Then he pays them that sela. And the Gemara says, Pshita, that's also obvious. That's what they agreed upon in the beginning. And the Gemara says, Lo no tzricha, it's necessary. The zol avidita, what happened was that the zol avidita meikara, that actually wage rates were actually lower before, meaning to say, the original agreed upon terms was actually more than the rate. V'agrinu b'tfei zuzah, he hired them for an extra zuz. U'lesofi yakar avidita, and then what happened was that wage rates actually went up, v'kam b'tfei zuzah, and it ended up being exactly what he had promised them before. So ma'u detema, what might you have said? Amri lei, they can say to him, Tvei zuzah amritlan, you gave us 1 zuz above the going rate. Tvei zuzah havlan, so now give us 1 zuz more, because the rate has gone up, we should always get 1 zuz above the going rate. Kamash Malana comes to teach us, Diyamar luhu, that he can say back to them, Ki amri lechu tvei zuzah delo have a kim lechu. Hashta kim lechu, when I said 1 extra zuz, that's because it wasn't certain with you exactly what you would be hired for. I wanted to make sure to hire. I wanted to make sure that you would do the work. Now we've already established that you're willing to do the work for this pay, and therefore we've agreed upon these terms. We're going to keep these terms. And Rashi explains, what might you have said, since according to the Rabbanon, the worker has the upper hand, Matzi Amri Le, they can say to him, and the Gemara then said, Lo kimlechu, he can respond to them. It was lo kimlechu, meaning lo hayisam yodim shetiyu ruin litol seller. You didn't know that you'd be able to get a seller for the work. Vani bekach hayavshi liskor, but I had the ability to hire for that amount. V'ra'isi bedaitchem shelo tisratzu b'pachos misel, and I saw in the way you were thinking that you would not agree for less than a seller. V'yamarti lahosiv zuz al schar pu'ula, and therefore I decided to add a zuz on the general rate, kadei litol seller lahashlam ritzonechem, in order that way you're going to get what you want, you'll get the seller. But hashta de kimlechu, but now, sha'kol notlin seller kiritzonechem, now that you realize that everybody's getting a seller like you wanted, al zos lo esnesi lahosif, on this, I never agreed to add, and therefore I don't have to add a zuz in this situation. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Bryce in the previous summit said, Rabbi Dosa Omer, Rabbi Dosa says, Shamin lahenes masha asad lahayasos, we evaluate what the future cost would be. Let's say the rates have changed. Hayayaf hashisha dinarim, let's say it's now going to cost the balabayas 6 dinar to hire workers to finish the other half of the job. So then he can deduct from these first workers, he can deduct from their wages, no sin lahem shekel, he can give them just a shekel instead of a selah. And the Gemara explains, Kasavar yad poel ala tachton, Rabbi Dosa holds that the worker has the lower hand, meaning to say in this situation, since the workers have stopped halfway through, and now for the owner to complete the work, he's going to have to pay more because wage rates have gone up, he's allowed to deduct that amount from these original workers. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Bryce again in the previous summit said, O yigmru malachtan v'yitlu shnei sloim, they can finish the work and take what they originally agreed upon, meaning 2 selah. And the Gemara says, Pshita, that's obvious. Again, that's what they originally agreed upon, so of course they can take 2 sloim. And the Gemara says, lo no tzricha, it's necessary, de zol avirita. What happened over here is that wage rates have gone down. V'yemor balabais, and so therefore the balabais, he's the one that said he no longer wants to hire them because he figured he could find people for cheaper. V'yazol po'el mufaisu, and then the workers came along and they appeased the balabais. They convinced the balabais to let them complete the job. Ma'u detema, what might you have said? Motzi amar lahu, that he can say to them, adaita de batzrisu li me'agre. The idea was that I was going to pay you less now. That's why I agreed when you appeased me. Kamash malon. So the Bryce is teaching the Amri lay. They say to him, adaita diavidinon loch avirita shapirta. It was really on the understanding that we would do better work. It had nothing to do with the idea that we would get paid less. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. Rabbi Dos on the previous summit said, "Sela nosin lahem sela." If the rates are the same and to complete the work is going to be one sela, so then he pays them a sela if they complete the work. And the Gemara says, "Pshita, isn't that obvious? Of course, that's what they pay. That's what they agreed upon." And the Gemara says, Amar Rav Huna Breder of Nasan, Rav Huna the son of Rav Nasan says, Lo no tzrich, it's necessary to ozilu inu gabe zuzam eikar. What happened was they actually agreed to a cheaper pay at the beginning by one zuz ulesof zol avidita, and then the pay rate, the wage rate went down. So ma'u detema, what might you have said? That botzer zuza amrisuli, that the balabayas can say that you agreed to work for a zuz less than the going rate. So botzer zuza yahivna lechu. So now that the rate went down, I should give you one zuz less than the going rate. Kamash malon. So that's what Rabbi Dos is teaching us. The Amr lay that they say back to him, Ki amarna loch bebotzer zuza. When we said we would do the work for a zuz less than the going rate, to lo avakimlach, that's because we weren't certain again in terms of what you actually could pay, and so we agreed to a cheaper rate. But hashta kimlach, but now you've already agreed to this rate, we do not have to go lower. And the Gemara continues on my Rav. Rav says, halacha Rabbi Dosa. The halacha is like Rabbi Dosa. The idea is that the Yad Poel, the worker, has the lower hand, according to Rabbi Dosa. But the Gemara continues, Umiyama Rav Hachi, but does Rav really say that the halacha is like Rabbi Dosa? V'yama Rav, but Rav said, Poel yachal lachzer ba'afilah v'chatzei hayom. A worker is allowed to retract even halfway through the day. It sounds like the worker has the upper hand. And the Gemara says, V'chitei mashani leila Rabbi Dosa bein schiras lekavlonos. If you're going to say that Rabbi Dosa makes a distinction between a worker that's paid for his time or paid for the job, and Rashi explains, Schiris again is Schir Yom, you're hired for the day. Shani le bein Schiris lekavlonos, maybe he makes a distinction between the two. The gabe Schiris isal haytaima da avodai heim velo avodim la avodim. By a person who's being paid for his time, there's an idea that he's not a slave, he can't be a slave to a slave, he's able to retract. Avol bekavlonos, but when you're hired to do a job, ein ze eved el liatzmo, he's not like a slave, he's working for himself. For Rabbi Dosa bekavlonos myri, maybe Rabbi Dosa said the worker has the lower hand by kavlonos. Kidakatani kiblu kamaliktzor, like it says, he was going to harvest a stalk. Uderab b'schir yom, and when Rav says that the poel can be choser even b'chatzi hayom, maybe that's talking about a schir yom. If you're going to say that we make that distinction, is that really true? Mishani le, do we really make that distinction? V'atanya, but we learned in a braysa, hasocher es hapoel u'lechatzi hayom shama shemeis lo meis. If he hires a worker and halfway through the day he hears that somebody died, o shachazas o cham, or he gets sick, im socher hu, so if he's a socher, if he's a hired worker for the day, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Ayin Zayin Amud Beis.